2021. This episode concludes the review and discussion of the findings of our April survey of your views on Alberta's economy. This coming Monday's newsletter included, this past Monday's newsletter included highlights of what we've learned from the survey and from our various webinars, and that it was included in the conclusion that will be reviewed today. We'll be tabling the draft recommendations stemming from the webinars and the survey at the end of today's webinar. I said tabling. The recommendations are quite comprehensive and are drawn from the survey findings in our webinar discussions. The recommendations will be featured in next Monday's newsletter for those of you that want to see it, because I'm not sending it out today. You won't actually see them. You'll hear them as either I'll read them or I have someone else lined up. But they will be the subject of a panel discussion next week at our Friday, June 4th webinar. And that webinar is scheduled for 2 o'clock, not 4 o'clock. How many people just heard 2 o'clock? Good, okay, so I said it correctly and you're listening. Barry Mayer, and I know most of you know who Barry is because he's been attending several sessions, and he was formerly a Deputy Minister of Economic Development in Alberta and has a wide career over a wide variety of industries. He's agreed to moderate the panel next Friday. The confirmed panelists, and this is why I'm really excited, include Justin Reamer, who is representing Western Diversification. I think most of us that are interested in the economy know who Justin is, and he'd been formerly in the Alberta government with the challenge to try and do some reform within Alberta Health. We made some comments on that last week. A second panelist is Lynn Brown, who's been appointed by Laura Kilcrease from Alberta Innovates. And the third is Leanne Hackman-Cardy, who participated in the webinar in April. She's the CEO of the Economic Developers of Alberta. And that seems apropos given that much of our discussions, of course, are about economic development, economic resilience. Each of the panelists will be receiving the recommendations today. They haven't received them yet, but this way they'll have them a week ahead of time. And a discussion of those recommendations will be the subject of next week's panel. So let's open discussion reflecting on the survey's conclusions. And you'll see the way I've structured this. And for those of you that are new, usually we have a pretty wide open discussion. Today, I'm going to structure it a little bit because I'm going to be presenting elements of the conclusion and then asking for your viewpoints. We'll have to see how well those viewpoints align with what you'll later hear in the recommendation. So it's a little bit of a game. Hopefully you'll have some fun and we'll enjoy this because it'll be a little bit different than what we've done in the past. Okay, I presume you can see that? Good, I see some heads nodding. So what I'm going to be doing is reviewing the conclusions which were in the newsletter on Monday, at least highlights. And I've assembled nine questions. I've assembled nine associated with those conclusions. So economic resilience is viewed by the public and governments as essential. We certainly learned that to mitigate the impact of shocks on the economy. And the shocks that are typically referred to are rapid and deep declines in the price of oil. Economic resilience is also a means of expediting economic recovery from such a shock or from shock no matter what it might be, such as COVID. So the first question is, why is monitoring of economic resilience in Alberta important? And what I've got down there is simply the introductory page of the last report in the spring or in the fall on economic resilience. So it's a wide open question. I don't expect it'll take hours to get the answer right, but does anybody want to jump in just to get us warmed up on why monitoring of economic resilience in Alberta is important? That is, why survey it at all? Somebody wants stage. Go ahead. I'm patient. This is like a teacher in a classroom.
Because perception is a great indicator of motivation, and people who are motivated act differently than those who are discouraged.
Okay, so we get a reading of who is motivated and possibly a reading of their sentiment regarding economic resilience. Any other input? On why?
I would like to say that it's part of the intelligence learning loop. If you don't know how well you're performing, what changes could you make to make things better? You want to know how well you're doing and measure against the goals. So by itself, monitoring is important, but you also have to have goals toward which you're striving.
So it gives you a benchmark
Yeah.
against which you can tally. And we started this in 2015, which became the beginning of developing a benchmark so we could measure progress. What I often argue, because nobody's getting paid to do this, is there's lots of talk about this topic, but there's very little action. And with all the talk, there's no reference point. People can say there's economic resilience, but what are they talking about? And I think much of us are rationalists and objective, and we look for something like data or a thermometer or a weather report that we could refer to and use that as sort of our anchor for discussion. It's also, there's a phrase called, measure what you value. And if we really do value economic resilience, you would think we would have had a measure of it. And as I indicated several times over the course of the last month, in discussions with Alberta Treasury and academia, I couldn't find a measure, nor did I find a particularly high level of interest in developing a measure. So we're doing it. And you're all helping through these discussions and through participating and contributing to the survey. The second point is—
Fenwick has his hand up, Perry.
Go ahead.
Right, Perry, I didn't know if we were using the golden hand or not, or just jumping in. So
No,
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Peter.
So just to build off of some of the points that have already been made around economic resilience, I do agree that it can be a reflection of the psyche, not just the pocketbook of Albertans or any economy for that matter. And so one of the things that I am mindful of is thinking through the relative mental health of Albertans and how that actually impacts the way choices are made. And so you could say in any team, you have the strength of the team dictates the success of the team. And then collectively, mental health is going to have an impact on that. I'll take that one step further by sharing that John Bethel, who's the E&Y lead on the Alberta Health Services Review, spoke to the annual general meeting of the Canadian College of Health Leaders Southern Alberta chapter a few weeks ago. And the question that I posed specifically to him was, what moves could the province make, should the province make in prioritizing the mental health of the population as we emerge from the pandemic? And there wasn't a clear answer. There's a lot of activity going on right now. We did know that mental health was considered to be the fourth wave to impact the healthcare system back when we were only talking about one wave of COVID last year. We're now on to the third wave with potential that's dragging out. And there's a lot of aspects of mental health of the province that are not being openly discussed that will impact the resiliency of individuals, not just the economy itself.
Okay, well, we may get to that further later on with one of the questions. Another aspect of this, of course, is if you're measuring it, you can get some indication of what's actually affecting it. So we can talk about economic resilience till the cows come home, but if we don't know anything about it or what affects it in terms up or down, improves or otherwise, we're playing in the dark. All roads will lead you there, and all it is a lot of speculation. And I think we've helped mature the discussion by being able to link it not just to oil and gas, but to see what events like COVID are doing to it as well. The question of how to, through management or through spending or through innovation ecosystems to affect it is, of course, very germane to all of this. And I think we're getting some indications of what actually budges the arrow. We've seen that Alberta's economy overall, and that is when we ask, corporate investment and jobs in particular, are viewed as weak, attributed to the overly vulnerability to broad swings in the price of oil, the so-called booms and busts, due to geopolitical events over which Alberta has little control. Measures to increase resilience since 2015 appear to be having a positive impact overall, as we saw with that black line rising almost steadily, almost continually since 2015. There's been a consistent improvement as oil prices recovered. That's the link of resilience to the price of oil since 2015, other than in the spring of 2020 when there was a break. And of course, that's when COVID hit, but also the price of oil turned negative to the point that it actually was at zero or below zero for a couple of days. What contributes to increasing economic resilience? That is, have we learned anything about what can be done or what has been done or what should be done in order to increase provincial, regional, or sectoral economic resilience?
Oops, what have I done?
Jump in. Jump in, Tom.
Oh, no, sorry, Barry, I'm not prepped yet. Go ahead.
Well, we certainly know that the measures of economic resilience, the most sensitive are corporate investment. So anything that could be done to secure and ensure and continue corporate investment would be a contributor. And anything that results in secure jobs, and that is jobs that are not affected by changes in the price of oil, would be increasing resilience in a jurisdiction that is today overly vulnerable to oil. So I think that's one of the ways to get at the answer, is to understand what are the primary measures of economic resilience as we saw them and as people referred to them. Some of you may have some other ideas that are specific to a sector or specific to a particular region. Perry, did you have your hand up there?
Yeah, I did. From my perspective, the only thing that can at least defend against changes in economic factors is economic diversity. We've seen, like, as far as speaking from my industry, sort of I'm waiting in, which is more or less animation production. When you hit the border, on the other side of the border in BC, there are hundreds of job openings of companies looking for animators. But as soon as you hit that border into Alberta, jobs don't exist. And this is a perfect example of why. So when one industry is down, other industries expand and they're an increase in demand. So if you don't have that diversity, you don't have the cushion to shift sideways.
We've got to qualify that a little bit, though, because in Alberta, we have diversity. We've got forestry, we've got agriculture, we've got tourism, we've got a lot of things going on. A lot of things would imply that we have diversity. And yet the province remains vulnerable to the price of oil, which is an indication that that the price of oil has infiltrated or has become integrated into so many industries in Alberta that they are vulnerable. Now, film may be one that is not vulnerable. Tourism is certainly vulnerable because of the reliance that the tourist industry has on hospitality in and around rural Alberta to accommodate those that are managing the rigs. But you make a good point.
Yep.
I just don't think it's enough. That diversity in itself is not economic resilience, but it can
I
be.
just want to make a point. I think a lot of it is because local industry, a lot of it is built up because of oil, not in the absence of oil. So because when oil's impacted, it impacts every other industry that although it may first appear to be diverse, but it directly has a direct influence on all the kind of cycle of businesses around it.
Well, that's my point. If it's integrated, it's going to have impact whether oil is up or down. And the phrase that's often used in Calgary is, when it's up, it couldn't be better. When it's down, there's a lot of hope that it'll be back quickly, which is part of the reason why little action has been done to, quote, diversify the economy or add to economic resilience. Is there was always the hope, because it's cyclical, that it would return. And in fact, it's in the process of recovering right now. And some of those of us are concerned that we're going to forget about economic resilience again because things are going to look rosy for a while.
So where those 100,000 jobs go? Because I remember back in 2016, there was a big event that was hosted by Calgary Economic Development to try and get those project managers and engineers something during the glut. You know, are they now employed? Did they actually go off and do other things? Did they sit on their severance and wait for the next sugar train?
Well, since you're relatively new to our discussion and may not have dug deep into the data, you're going to get an answer to that when we take a look at the next slide on the next question, which was improvement in economic resilience is evident over the last 5 years, with all regions and sectors benefiting from measures to reduce their interdependency on the oil and gas subsector. The Calgary region, and to somewhat lesser extent, the other regions, are experiencing the most gains in the sentiment of economic resilience. And that's illustrated in the graph on the left. And if I showed that over time, you would see that Calgary was the lowest in the province when things were really in bad shape back in 2015. But for some reason, Calgary has now bumped up and exceeds all of the regions in economic resilience. So what has Calgary and the other regions been doing that maybe Edmonton hasn't, and why? And I think you're leading into that with your question or your observation, Peter. So does anyone want to kick in and speculate on what Calgary may have been doing, or you may even be in the know?
There's a lot of tech here in Calgary.
Okay. And is that relatively new?
Well, as the rest of you know, the digital world has just exploded exponentially, and this seems to be where people are coming as, and I'm not saying that they're not going to Edmonton, even though the University of Alberta has this big digital reputation. The capital seems to be coming to Calgary.
Mary Moran, when we brought her up from Calgary Economic Development, made exactly that point. We've recently heard, I can't remember the name of the company that brought 500 jobs to Calgary that's in the infotech space.
Right.
Anybody else have any other speculation on what was been happening in Calgary?
I got a quick question and a comment. It's John here. What are you measuring by the 0 to 70% on this chart? What are you actually measuring?
We've asked the question of those in the Edmonton region, of those in the Calgary region, and those in the other regions. So based on their location, we asked them where they were residing. We asked them, is the province of Alberta economically resilient? And 48% said yes or somewhat.
Okay, so it's a survey percentage then. It's not a dollar amounts or
No,
company.
it's a percentage. Yeah.
Okay. The thing that you're forgetting about Calgary is that Calgary has, or used to have, a stock exchange, and like in the oil patch, there were 2 land guys in Edmonton. All 50 other ones are down in Calgary. That gives you an idea of where the action is if you want to buy and sell companies and do something in that business at any rate. And so there's a lot more action in Calgary than in Edmonton in that respect.
Whatever it is, and maybe they've ramped up the attempt to attract companies to Calgary and have been successful at it. Maybe there's something else that's been going on in Calgary. Is there anything else going on in Calgary besides business attraction? Peter, you alluded to it, Peter.
I alluded to it.
Look, how many people were out of work in Calgary?
Over 100,000.
Yeah, over 100,000. Isn't that a significant event? Do you think that might have contributed to increased entrepreneurship, increased innovation?
Well, that was the whole point. I mean, when the rainforest movement initiated in Calgary,
Right.
It was around the same time.
Right.
And it was, but what I'm not close to, Perry, right now is how sticky that became 5 years later.
Yep.
And how many of the roles people just diverted back into the energy sector versus actually, stayed and did something else.
Well,
Versus moved away, because there were a lot of people that moved away at the time.
yeah, certainly out-migration as a sensitive measure for a short period of time was much higher than it is right now. But it is a correlation that 100,000 people went out of work and the Calgary region's economic resilience went up. Now, that sounds like an oxymoron, but if you think about it, when you throw a lot of people out of work, they either go on welfare or they become entrepreneurial. And in a recent editorial that I wrote, I was saying one of the best things that could have happened to economic resilience in Calgary was COVID and the crash in the price of oil. Now that may sound like celebrating a negative, but if you care about economic resilience, we just had a windfall and Calgary is benefiting from it. For some reason, Edmonton didn't, because it didn't lose 100,000 jobs. And in fact, the NDP government hired, 14,000 more people during the last period. So there is a silver lining in what has been going on with regard to the price of oil. When people have said in the past how great it is when it's good in the oil and gas, and how there's so much hope when it's bad, it appears that people lost a sense that oil would be recovering. It was a rather extended period between 2015 and 2020. And that may well have also contributed to people becoming more entrepreneurial as they were no longer ready or interested or willing to wait. So it's speculation, but again, it does appear to quite reasonable that there's something happened in Calgary and in the other regions, many of which had rural employment associated with the oil and gas industry, that they've been adjusting.
Yeah, Perry, if I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
Imad here. There's quite a cultural difference in the labor force between Calgary and Edmonton. And this is very fundamental for what you're seeing. Yeah. Your labor force in Calgary is working for the private sector, primarily. They are used to the culture of taking risk in business. Through their employment, through their enterprise and the day-to-day actions. When you look at Edmonton, majority of your labor force here is working for the government. They're unionized, and really they're used to the concept of having a job, not necessarily investing in a job. So when you look at the investment market between Calgary and Edmonton, I find a lot of my colleagues in Edmonton, the biggest twist that they will do is to go and buy a second house and go into the real estate investment. But the concept of opening an enterprise from scratch or investing in a new startup is a non-starter for them. Whereas in Calgary, it's a whole different aspect.
You're bang on. You're just a little bit ahead of my my series of questions. But no. Bear with us. You have hit something about what does not contribute to economic resilience. And as we'll see, there is something in Edmonton that is restraining or constraining what Calgary otherwise didn't have. And it may be its culture. It may be its the makeup of the sector in terms of the ratio of industry to professions to public services. But we'll see that further. And I think those of you who have looked at the data a little more carefully will see that what he's just said holds a lot of weight.
Yeah. I think Perry Larry here, that born and raised in Calgary in the oil and gas industry, I can tell you that there's some structural differences that they're cultural, and they go back to how the oil and gas industry was formed. A lot of people were brought up from Dallas and Houston because there wasn't any Canadian expertise. And that attitude, I think, to some degree still exists in Canada, or in Calgary. Mm-hmm. So you've got that kind of, damn the torpedoes, well, we're going to make it work, and a kind of attitude in Calgary. Plus, there's something else that also exists in Calgary, and that's not well recognized, and it's the amount of computer capacity, data processing capacity that exists in Calgary is phenomenal. It's as much as what's in Toronto, simply because of the oil and gas industry. So there's that underlying infrastructure that also exists there.
Excellent point. And further to what was said a moment ago, it isn't just the high level of employment in government and that in fact it's unionized, but it's a high level of employment in the health sector, which is also unionized and also a public service, and the high level of employment in the education sector with Grant MacEwan and Concordia and the University of Alberta, et cetera. So you have a density of public service employment. So when Calgary lost 100,000 jobs, Edmonton wasn't losing any at all, because it had the buffer. Now, is that a sign of economic resilience? Well, it is to the extent that the Alberta government can afford it, and that the public was willing to sustain that. But as we have seen from time to time, at some point in another, austerity kicked in, or a transformation or an adjustment occurs. It's just it lags Calgary, or it lags the change in the price of oil. Question 4 was increases in diversity do not equate to increased economic resilience. And I think, Perry, you and I discussed that earlier. If this is true, please explain. And I think the explanation was that it depends on what the makeup is associated with diversity. If all you have is a shotgun and a lot of things going on, and you get hit by a shock, whether it be a COVID or an oil price, and everything deteriorates, then that diversity really didn't contribute to economic resilience. So the answer really is it depends. And as we'll see later, that there is a balance between industry, professions, and public services that appears to be a better balance than another. And that may be what Calgary has been striving for, but Edmonton hasn't yet kicked in.
Harry,
Yes.
did the survey capture economic, or I should say, the role of government,
Yes.
specifically federal government?
I think that's
procurement?
question 7.
Is it? Okay.
We'll get to that. So,
Thank you. Sorry.
Peter, I should have invited you ages ago. It's excellent for you to come on
No, I
in.
apologize. I haven't read the document ahead of time.
That's okay. The public sector, public services sector is a weak contributor to economic resilience compared to other industries and professions. Public services are overrepresented in the Edmonton region compared with other regions, contributing to having the weakest economic resilience among the regions. And I'll explain this as I did last week a little further. That 30% is 30% of the people from the Edmonton region said that Alberta's economy is resilient, very or somewhat. Only 30%. 70% said otherwise. Those in industries, 31% of the respondents from Edmonton were from industry, 32% were from the professions, and 37% were from the public sector. So we had a somewhat higher representation of the public sector in Edmonton than we did in any of the other regions. And in the index, that is from a scale from 1 to 5, you can see the rating of those in the public sector of the province's resilient was the lowest at 2.58 versus those in industry saw it as somewhat higher. So the bias or the perspective of what sector you are interested in does seem to have a bearing on how you are looking at the province, with those in the public sector looking at it as weaker than those in industry. The percentage of those in industry that said the province was resilient was 30%, whereas those in the public sector saw it at only 28, and those in the profession saw it at 34. What we have in the box to the right is the most heavily represented industries in Edmonton were transportation, agriculture, and construction. Ignore the low because there were very few respondents there, but that was low. In the professions, management and human resources rated the province's resilience highest, and in the public sector, the highest came from health. So it gives you some sense of what the distribution is. What I'm going to make another observation, which isn't on the chart, and this is personal. I was engaged as an advisor by Bill Smith some years ago in a consultation and a team that was assembled to help advise the city of Edmonton on what it might do to advance manufacturing as a value-added opportunity to advance the economic resilience of the region. One of the observations was that Edmonton was a throughput economy. We had a lot of oil, a lot of agricultural product, a lot of mineral, a lot of raw material flowing through Edmonton. We had great pipelines, we had great rail, we had great air cargo, we had great trucking links, but we didn't have processing. And that may be one of the other differences, because the distribution of represented industries in Calgary was energy, infotech, agriculture, but transportation wasn't as high. So I think what you're also seeing in Edmonton is it not, maybe that attitude is relevant, and I would agree it probably is, but you're seeing a higher representation of public sector, and you're also seeing a different type of mix in industries. And it's not a mix that was contributing as well as highly to economic resilience as it was elsewhere. So what should the Edmonton region do? This can be really fun.
I mean, like quit electing the NDP?
That shows up repeatedly in the survey, which means I'm probably getting somewhat of a political bias, but conceivably. I mean, let's not dismiss that too quickly. There are obviously those that view NDP looks at the economy differently than does UCP. And so their approach during the downturn was to hire a lot of government employees. So having an NDP government might be a strategy for economic resilience when things are bad.
Okay, but they become a drag on the economy when it recovers, I think.
So you're not getting economic resilience. You may be getting a one-trick pony. Any other observations or comments on what Edmonton region should do or not do?
Yeah, so based on your premises, lay off public sector employees, because then perhaps they will become entrepreneurial and start businesses.
No need to laugh. I mean, we can say it with a tinge of humor, so nobody really wants to take us too seriously, but that is not unusual. I can recall back during the Lougheed era, when one of the ministers set up his new agency in the Philippines, which moved a lot of staff out of Alberta, out of the region that were public sector. I can recall during when I worked for Bob Bogle and the province triggered regionalization. And through regionalization, we moved a lot of public servants out of Edmonton and distributed them around the province, which was a plus for the economies in those rural areas, but also reduced the ratio of public sector employees in Edmonton. So there are some things that people have tried to do in that regard. And clearly with Steve Young under the Klein era, or was mandated to close down the Department of Economic Development and a lot of other things. So they went through a period of very high layoffs as an effort to reduce whether it was just to reduce the debt and get Alberta back to zero, or whether it was to reduce public sector because of the poor impact it had on the Edmonton economy. I suspect it was the former.
We do have to be careful though, Perry.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead, Ilona.
Okay, thanks, Pete. You know, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but you mentioned hemp in your recommendations here.
Hemp?
And one of the things about hemp right now is the cost of lumber is so exorbitant. Okay,
yep.
So hemp has 6 things going for it. It first of all, it is fire resistant. You can hold a blowtorch up to it. We've had fires everywhere. It is also mold resistant. It is soundproof. It is economical, especially now with lumber. It can be used for all sorts of things, including, and I think it's around the highway to Fort McMurray, where they're experimenting with lignin, which is the cellulose fiber in concrete. And I was just on a webinar a couple of days ago about the construction waste that goes into landfills. It is huge amounts. So why doesn't somebody up there start a hemp research facility, because there are so many uses for it. And I will shut up now.
No, I mean, I think that is something that the Edmonton region could consider. You've mentioned one emerging industry. It would complement what farmers are doing in agriculture. It would provide manufacturing opportunities. There's transportation that goes along with it. There's storage and warehouse. And there are many things associated with developing an industry, whether it be in hemp or infotech or whatever it would be, that is not an established industry, and you'd be in relatively early. So that's a good idea. Any other ideas?
Yeah, so Perry, I'll jump in and make the comment I was going to make earlier. It was more to follow through with your suggestion about what does shifting a government worker into the broader public sector actually mean? I think you're referring to the agency that is just spun out of Alberta Economic Development.
Yeah.
Just because funding goes outside to a transfer payment agent or recipient doesn't lower the cost of government delivering a service. It just shifts it from the core out to the broader public sector itself. So the whole cost of government is always measured as an inclusive number, right? Remember that about 80% of the cost of government is actually distributed, not run by a department. One of the observations that I've been making over the last number of years that's concerning is I feel like with the way funding has been flowing to support not just agencies, but individuals through grants to support entrepreneurs, and the number of quote unquote accelerator programs, incubator programs, advisory service networks that have emerged. And now, granted, some of us have benefited from that financially as individuals or as our inks, but I want to say this out loud. It feels like there are more people supporting entrepreneurs in Alberta right now than there are entrepreneurs in Alberta right now. And I think that's a problem.
It's, I've heard otherwise, Peter, and it's not to say that, I'm the be all and the end all for truth, but there are some that say we have a very high ratio of startups in Alberta. We just don't have a lot that grow, and that the target should not be increasing the number of startups, but should be developing an ecosystem that provides adequate support through money, marketing, manpower, mergers, marriages, metrics, and all of the things that it takes to keep a company alive through that valley of death.
Yeah,
it's not
startup
entrepreneurship.
So I agree to a degree, but a startup does not mean hanging up a shingle and being a one-person sole proprietorship.
Correct. We have discussed something that nobody yet has made reference to, and I think it's very significant. Edmonton has a strong health, education, and government. Each of those have been developed in the last 100 years. They're supplier focused. They're supplier intense because we've been building a system. And when you build a system, you focus on getting adequate capacity and supply. You build hospitals, you attract doctors, you do everything at the top to get everything in place. What is often ignored during that supply-centric period? The consumer, the very person for whom the systems were built, the student come alumni, the client. The client is one step above a slave in Roman times because they are subservient to the knowledge held by the professional in health, education, engineering, etc. So what we have is in Edmonton is supply oriented in its public sector, not consumer oriented. If you want to start bringing about change and reform, which we talked about last week intensely and passionately, you need to shift the focus from the supplier to the consumer. Peter, this is what's going to make you famous. It is a recognition that maybe Alberta is done. I don't mean finished, but is done in the building phase, and now needs to start using that for the very purpose for which it was built in the first place, which is to serve people.
You might recall our Red Deer event in 2016.
Absolutely.
That was the message.
Absolutely. And I repeat it again. This is called personalization. And if you look at what data is doing, and I listened to a Canada West, the bank talk today. I've listened to RBC. I see what Calgary is doing. I know what the Internet of Everything, the Internet of Things. Everything that's going on in the world of technology is oriented toward what? Personalization, fintech, stem cells, health gauge, wearables. Everything is trying to give the individual what the individual is now demanding because they have an education and they have access to the internet. This is transition time, baby. And if the rigidity and the status quo and the maintenance of the status quo by health, education, and government doesn't recognize it, you don't need a policy of privatization. The consumer is going to take you there in a democracy. And that was my advice to government some years ago when I was director of privatization. You don't need an ideology. Technology will fill the gap. The individuals will rise, and they will no longer be tolerant of waiting in line. and they will want to go somewhere with their wealth to buy whatever it is that they're waiting for. And it's going on right now. So I think one of the things Edmonton should do is just get the systems focused on the person and also add elements of competition which drive innovation.
Will the new policies of the UCP support that?
This was exactly what was on the table as policies until COVID hit, and then they couldn't proceed. But I'm not taking it from their songbook. I'm picking up on it from all of what we've been doing, all of what we've been talking about, and the passions I hear from Tom to Perry to Yogi to Ilona. I don't think we're a political movement. I think we are reflecting reasonably intelligent people who have an appetite to say, get the government off my back. Stop regulating my behavior and telling me what washroom my kids have to go to. Let me be free. Give me liberty, or give me Rachel.
Liberty
Next.
power, yeah.
Could I add my 2 cents for a minute?
Yes, please.
I've got a couple of notes here. First of all, it was really a shame of all the government departments to chop. Why would they chop economic development? But that's just a comment. Now, when you compare Calgary to Edmonton, here's what like with global and that sort of stuff. You find that when they forced Edmonton and the surrounding areas to get together, we had hundreds of officials get together at those meetings. You do something like down in Calgary, and it's less than half the number of people. Down in Arizona, in Phoenix, you have to have about 4 people for the same geographic area. Give you some idea of how top heavy in the baggage we have to work with here. We have a lot of extra overhead in the bureaucracy. When you're a marketing guy, you want to actually build something as a manufacturer. Edmonton is the greatest boom for the communities around Edmonton because of their taxation and the way they handle businesses. And that's why a lot of guys in that business move outside of Edmonton. And that's part of the problem of Edmonton and its bureaucracy, or the way that they run things here. Hemp is also supported by Alberta Agriculture, and there are farmers doing that. And what was the other thing? System financing. I've been involved in helping Shaw raise money and Stantec, and Shaw left Edmonton. Why? They started here. And so that gives you some idea of the differences between Edmonton and Calgary in that respect, at any rate. The strength, yes, we have tremendous resources being spent, irrespective of what the economy or the customer wants, because it's government funded. Anyway, hopefully that'll get some comments going from the other people, and I'd appreciate any feedback. Thank you.
Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. It's Barry, and I apologize for being late. Traffic coming up Highway 2 is at fault.
You were missed. It's been very dull until you arrived.
Doesn't sound like it at all. 2 comments. One, well, both of them I lived. I was the official from the Alberta government that for 2 years, me and Don Masick, we plant director of plant industry, finally got, after 2 years of effort, licenses to do hemp research, agriculturally, agronomics. And that goes back now, gosh, 15 years. But having said that, we still, and the Research Center for Hemp is a good idea. The problem we got with hemp is that mainstream commercial agriculture producers producing for world markets, because of the cost of the alterations or the new equipment that are required for a crop that is so strong that it tears equipment apart, we haven't got available any reasonable equipment at a reasonable cost. And then the processors don't know why they can't get a regular, sizable flow of product for processing on a year-to-year basis. And so other people pick it up, and then they get into trouble because they can't get enough, and they disappear, and the producers get mad. and it's a tough thing. But the research side, I would strongly recommend, and I've seen a couple of proposals that way, to take a look at the big thing for crops is for food purposes in this climate. And because we pay more for food than we do building materials or whatever else, and it's more important that we get it. Is the edible oil. The edible oil nutritionally is amazing. The damn stuff burns if you have a match within 20 feet of it, and it's unstable. That's all research. We can solve those problems, but we got to get somebody to focus on putting some money towards it. And I suggest it's, this is my bias, I suggest it's got to be industry, because there's enough other demands on our situation. Very quickly on economic development, I was the deputy minister second to last. They kept closing departments behind me. And the reason, the real reason is the public was pushing so hard because our economy was so hot and nobody could compete with the energy industry's wages, that it was considered that more economic development was a bad thing rather than a good thing. And that was the mood of the public of the day. And politicians respond to the mood of the day of the public, because within the next 2 to 3 years, at maximum 4, they got to go back to that public to get their jobs maintained. So with that, I'll shut up.
Oh, thank you. I think there's been enough expression of the relevance of hemp as a possible opportunity for, quote, industry development that it warrants something in the field of recommendation. We'll talk about that before the day's out. On the question of why economic development we got hit, I think we've heard that. I think we also are aware that was a general attitude that government should not be picking and choosing winners. So what's involved in economic development for? But there's ways to do that otherwise. On the there are layoffs going on.
Do we believe that? Is that a generally? Is there consensus on that, Perry?
That's up for discussion. I think everybody and their brother knows full well that governments all over the world are involved in economic development. And
well, no, but picking winners and losers, that particular comment, I think that's a fallacy to believe that that's not the case.
Maybe needs to be revisited.
I think that's definitely not the case. I give Perry some. So one of the things I want to make a comment in Edmonton is you see a lot of money goes to famous people, these things make Alberta look good, AI, something. So you have a lot of money going to like the top notch, the research, the Nobel Prize, but those things does not impact large population. It's stay on as the top notch research. So government's definitely picking the winners and giving a lot of money into the few winners, but the large ones are not getting the support they need. And I give an example before with oil industry versus other industry. See, the support is totally different.
Yeah, I think the whole domain of research, in order for it to make a contribution to economic resilience, it's not the hiring of researchers that we're talking about. It's the production of something that in fact can result in wealth creation. So it's getting it out of the laboratory into the market. And you would think that with the intensity we have of a university, a research university that attracts $1 billion of research money, that we would be overwhelmed with innovations in this region, but we're not. So there seems to be some gap. And as we'll talk about that when we get to the supply chain for commercialization of research, when we talk about the innovation ecosystem. It's also flawed in the Edmonton region, is we've not been able to get to commercialize and to bring research out into the market. And so when they invested $1 billion in nanotech and nothing came out into the market. They're now investing in artificial intelligence, but they're trying to locate it and give it some private sector features in the hope that it will actually have a contribution to the commercialization of jobs and the commercialization of new opportunities. So research alone is not enough. It's research and development and commercialization.
And that's the point I was going to add to there,
Good.
Perry. Exactly, that's exactly right. And what can we do specifically to improve the commercialization, such as attracting product development managers, for example, as the keystone species in the ecosystem, but also the accelerators and incubators and things like Tech Edmonton that would have continued to serve us well. Anyway, yeah, there's a number of tools and things that we need to support.
Obviously, someone didn't think that Tech Edmonton was serving us well because it's been closed down and pulled back into the university. Now, whether they're going to come up with another alternative, I don't know. We are going to see an election in Edmonton shortly, and maybe that election, the public will speak up, and we'll have to see whether the public is sympathetic to the principles that we're raising, or whether or not they want to see more government involvement in more aspects of their lives, and that the economy is secondary to social issues. We'll just have to see how that plays out. The most appropriate roles for governments in proactive economic development, distinct from reactive economic recovery, are in policy formulation, promoting entrepreneurship and small business startups, employing incentives for encouraging small business innovation, and investing in research that affects long-term job creation. Note, establishing a rainy day savings account was not included in our list of options, as it would constitute a reactive versus a proactive option. So the top items were, as I stated, formulating policies, promoting entrepreneurship, and investing in research, much of which we've talked about to this point. Can you be any more specific as to what policies, incentives, and/or employment research should be recommended? Well, we've heard hemp. I think I alluded to personalization versus socialization, or customer or consumer oriented versus supplier. We did see the Alberta government recently cancel a tax incentive program, which was to promote innovation and the pooling of capital, which, by the way, when we asked the question, what has been going on in Calgary different from Edmonton, they have done a massive job in pooling private capital to support innovation. And Edmonton's got, a TNT startup and a few lightweight things, but nothing like what's going on in Calgary in order to promote innovation. So, and that's coming out of private sector. That's not government sponsored. So any other ideas?
I'll float the policy question that we've been discussing for over a decade. And it's not my idea. I'll give credit to a lot of folks before me in beating this drum. So two things. How is it that our largest single cost center in government spend, being the Department of Health, gets away with not having accountability for some form of economic development? And then closely following that is what is preventing procurement from supporting a try first, buy first mindset to facilitate the scaling of innovations that are developed at home?
I'll jump in there for a moment, Peter, because we did do some survey research among administrators and contractors in public procurement to learn their views of where our strengths and weaknesses were. And it was a very negative result. Is both administrators of public procurement and contractors of public procurement of governments in Alberta, not just Alberta government, but municipal as well, were very frustrated by the leaning of public procurement as a vehicle to advance social objectives. Equity, balanced racial issues, poverty, but they were not balanced in order to address economic issues. They all recommended a review and that this get fixed.
And you're quoting the survey from 3 years ago?
Yeah.
So since then, we know the movement of Buy Social Canada, this is the entity out of Vancouver, is promoting a lot of this. It's the social procurement movement. It's formally putting in things that you mentioned into the rubric of procurement scoring. But that's separate from what I believe I'm raising, which is whether it's health or education or otherwise, education tech, health tech, et cetera, provides moments to not just improve healthcare, but have inflection points to innovate and really change health outcomes. But we still cannot figure out how to support local entrepreneurs beyond the research bench. And being a consumer or a user is not the same as issuing a purchase order.
But you're facing not just you're facing a bias.
Mm-hmm.
That the public procurement system is being used for secondary purposes. I think it was economic developers Alberta that pointed out to us how effective public procurement was to help economic recovery in Fort McMurray after the fire. So it has been used for economic purposes, but by and large, the bias in the last 10 years has been towards social enterprise, towards social measures of fixing our society's social issues and not addressing or using it as an employment tool, an economic tool. So I think you're on the right track. I mean, not that my views are particularly relevant, but I certainly recognize that this is an area, a special interest area that needs to be addressed. The difficulty with incentives, if they're often short term, I mean, you can put an incentive in for advancing solar and geothermal and wind, but when you pull the incentives out, the motivation disappears. Germany found that out. The employment research, you want to make doggone sure that it's real jobs that are being created. The survey work that we did with Alberta youth, their principal concern was the future of work, given what is happening with AI, and given the status of the employment of the economy. Alberta youth are very nervous about job opportunities into the future. So when we look at employment research, you want to make doggone sure that you're developing the skill sets that they're going to need in a rapidly changing world where you may not know what technologies are the basis of your economy in the future. So it's continuous learning that you want to see, and a lot of relational processes skills need to be developed.
Perry, that's a huge problem in Japan today, maybe bigger than here. It's not unique to Alberta or Canada or North America.
No, but it could be incredibly destabilizing when you have high levels of unemployment among youth.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's not, don't address it as a social issue, address it as an economic issue because they want to work. And if you come up with a guaranteed annual income and think you solve the problem, good luck. Work is embodied in what people want and recognize as of value for their own identity.
Harry, let me put in my 2 cents worth. All of us seniors here, myself included, should be going out and finding somebody to job share with, and should only be invited back to your forum here unless we bring 1, 2, or 3 youngsters with us to train to take over our bitching job.
Look, and, let's make it fun. Go create 2 young kids and bring them forward.
Oh, very funny, yeah. Well, I can rent them real easy, okay? There's lots around to rent.
Yeah. No, I think the whole idea of seniors playing a continuing role, we've talked about the meaning of life and whether or not as an aging population, the seniors are bailing out, or seniors today are not retiring, but are wanting to stay involved in doing meaningful things. Mentorship is certainly one of them.
Yep. I also suggest that we have a problem in Alberta with the Alberta Securities Commission. If you want to raise money to set up a company, etc., we have a lot of impediments in the way. They've come up with some new rules, and if you want to do an aspect like a special acquisition fund, we used to have these small business equity corporations in Alberta. That went by the wayside, and with the tax shelter thing you had a few years ago, that's on the wayside. Try to get people involved in Edmonton in this area, and there's lots of business opportunities here, but the fastest way to clear a room is to ask them if they want to sit on the board of directors and have their name both financially and criminally checked out. The room empties real fast. Down in Calgary, they're much more geared to set up, and by the ratio of 50, 60 to 1 compared to Edmonton. And that's why a lot of action in that regard is down there. And I would hardly suggest, if you look back, we used to have some stock exchanges and some stockbrokers up here to actually do underwritings in Edmonton. Where are they now? They've all been skewered and are history. The only way to do that is down in Calgary. That's where the action is. And I would suggest that that's something that maybe we could assist with or change the culture up here, because that would make a heck of a difference in fostering resilience and economic development that's non-government related here.
Well, I think you're touching on something that is quite intriguing, and that is I've been of the view that as government accumulates the levels of debt that it's accumulating, particularly at the federal level right now, that the probability of the federal government introducing a wealth transfer tax to take from baby boomers the wealth that they've accumulated and denying it to be passed on to their kids, but using it to pay off debt, ought to scare the bejesus out of seniors to begin to look for alternatives, which would be the basis for setting up some tax deferral or deferral away from a wealth transfer tax to get that money working for Alberta youth by creating innovative opportunities. So I think the threat of a wealth transfer tax might just trigger seniors to wake up to the fact that they better come up with some other alternatives, because government is going to sniff that $1 trillion wealth transfer as a ready way of resolving its debt. But I'm going to leave that alone and move on to the next one, or we won't, because 5:15 we've got something special to do. A special interest is the low value attributed to government purchasing power as an option for economic development. Peter, you'll be interested in this one. Using government purchasing power to develop and attract businesses, Alberta was one of the lower at 32%. It didn't disappear. Why would public procurement not be more highly recommended as an option to improve economic resilience? Well, right now, the answer has been because social issues are trumping economic issues in the mind of the public or in the mind of the politician. Until the economy went to hell in Calgary, attention being paid to economic resilience was not there, but it's certainly there now. Edmonton has not faced what Calgary has faced, and as a consequence, it continues to be NDP minded or socially sensitive. Now, maybe with a new mayor and maybe with the austerity that seems to be coming, and universities laid off, how many thousand jobs are being lost in the University of Alberta? I mean, there is austerity underway. That may just trigger a wake-up call that we need to do something for our economy, where it was only Calgary that seemed to be paying attention. Anyone add anything more to question 7?
Yeah, one quick thing we found, there's a lot of government assistance available. If you can find a way to generate business and jobs to replace things that we're importing into the province, there's all sorts of government assistance and help available, because they like that. If it's a $20–30 million at a crack, that's something to concentrate on. If anybody has a concept or idea in that regard, I'd really like to hear that we'd help finance and be involved in that. Thank you.
Well, I had a phone call yesterday from a large foundation. It's international, and it has a lot of money to distribute, and found its way to Alberta because it really liked the idea of hydrogen. We haven't talked about hydrogen. Bill Neely is the assistant deputy minister or associate minister. It's conceivable that hydrogen and some of the technologies to clean up emissions may well attract capital back into Alberta. Hydrogen seems to be holding a lot of promise, and there's a lot of interest in it possibly becoming a major alternative to oil as we've known it, or the energy industry as we've known it. Anybody have any knowledge or comments regarding hydrogen?
Only one.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
All right. Actually, hydrogen is being tested even for steel making.
Yep.
And my partner works very closely with Dr. David Lazell at the University of Calgary, who is heading up the energy transition initiative. And he's working very closely with hydrogen, and
right.
It holds a lot of promise.
Yep.
You're absolutely right.
Barry, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, my only comment is that we've got a huge catch up to go on just understanding and what our role can be and whatever. Yeah. The Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese are just years ahead of us in developing the hydrogen economy, even though they've got, gone to electricity for, but electricity from what, I guess is the question. And they seem to think it fits, the hydrogen economy is what it's going to be, because it leaves less of a footprint when you've used up the hydrogen. And that's basically what I know about it. But it's we need to get going if we're going to play in that game.
Well, it seems to be underway. I mean, this is not something we're going to be inventing. I think we would see it as complementary to the basic direction that we think Edmonton region in particular, because it's the industrial heartland out in Sturgeon, that would be the contributor. So that's a positive.
Here's something that might be of interest.
Yeah.
There's two areas. Number one, we've had investment proposals for people to convert natural gas into a very high quality form of diesel. Now that didn't go anywhere, but the guys down in Calgary managed to raise $40 million for one of the plants to try this out. They haven't built the plant yet. Number two, probably the least popular investment right now that we have lots of is coal. We can find coal in this province that doesn't need to be purified. It can be shipped. It's the highest quality that you can get in the world, just west of Edmonton. And we have tons of this stuff. And obviously, when I ask people to help me buy coal assets, the room clears very fast again. But we had a presentation from a fellow that was about 74 years old, about my age now, from England. And his dad bought a whole bunch of leases out by Edson and area in the 1950s. And for like $50,000, $60,000, it became a little company called Luscar Coal, if anybody remembers that company, which was worth about $4 billion at its peak and is now worth minus 4 million. It went down, of course, so it's very cyclical, but we still have the aggregate out there. We have a tremendous resource, and coal over in Germany and other places is modified and changed into fuels that aren't dangerous, for one thing, as hydrogen can be. And we have this resource, and we have all sorts of assistance available, supposedly in research. But we got to find more markets, more people that will buy this stuff from us at retail, not ship the raw materials out. Anyway, your turn.
No, I mean, we've got assets. Those assets, unfortunately, right now are sitting on the wrong side of the social activist equation. And
great, long as the price is low, I'm happy to buy.
If we can tie the world clean to it, or the word clean or green to it, we seem to have some possibilities. So I'm going to jump ahead because we've got only a few more minutes till 5:15.
You're doing great.
The innovation ecosystem is viewed as very important in achieving economic resilience. I think we've generally acknowledged that. While still weak at 2.69 in the index, or only 29% rating Alberta's innovation ecosystem as effective, progress has still been evident since 2015 in the continuous development of the innovation ecosystem. This is most evident in the Calgary region and least in the Edmonton and other regions. So as you'll see, 45% of the respondents rated Calgary's innovation ecosystem, or in Calgary rated the innovation ecosystem as effective, whereas only 23% in Edmonton, and the 25% in others because of the lack of accelerators and incubators. So the focus here is, why is the Calgary region's innovation ecosystem viewed as so much more effective? And I'm going to jump in and give you a little bit of color from Mary Moran. The community has been engaged. The innovation ecosystem is not a bureaucratic operated entity. There are entrepreneurs, billionaires who have benefited from the proceeds of drilling and the oil and gas industry that are today involved in, quote, the innovation ecosystem, not as an administrative bureaucratic job-making structure run by government or universities, but taken on by executives in that community that are raising money to finance innovation, plus the fact that Calgarians are getting involved in making investments. So that's possibly the attitude or the culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, and enterprise that constitutes, quote, the innovation ecosystem. Whereas in Edmonton, we think about it as, quote, a system of managers and administrators that have jobs working in a building regulated and granted by the university or by government. The innovation ecosystem in Calgary is a completely different animal. It is of the community, not of government. That's the difference. And yet the people that seem to be asking are people in government saying, well, what can we do to make the innovation ecosystem work better? We've got to get citizens asking that question.
But Perry, Rainforest Edmonton didn't take off, or didn't seem to take off in the same way that Rainforest Calgary did.
Yep.
Why?
A lot of special interests. Edmonton is a center of a lot of associations. There are 23,000 nonprofit associations in Alberta, and most of them are headquartered in Edmonton. Edmonton is also an NGO center because it's a center of influence for government. That's part of the reason. The weakest elements in the innovation ecosystem, and this is, we're right now at the top of Everest. What are the weakest elements in this system? Their vision and leadership and management processes. Things that human beings do to make that system work or not. The strongest are the resources and the infrastructure. That's the physical assets. 62% viewed vision and leadership as effective. 69% as resources, 76% as infrastructure. But what managers and administrators do, which is communicate, decision make, network, organize, account, 55%. Our problems are in how we manage what we have, not what we have. How can the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystems be improved? Look at the top line. Sustained vision and leadership. The research that we did on the impediments to economic development in Edmonton were clearly focused on, as I said last week, one, the weather, and secondly, sustained vision and leadership. The vision was social, it wasn't economic. The leadership wasn't there, it was absent. Now we have global Edmonton. It's conceivable that we have a municipality that is now regional in focus. We might be able to get back to the economy. Anybody want to add anything? I'm rushing a little bit there. I apologize, but I've got the podium. Anyone add anything? Okay, it's 5:15. Time's up. While progress on most fronts is evident, weakness is still apparent both in the innovation ecosystem and overall in economic development. Remember, Calgary is still weak. It's still hovering around 3, just a little bit below 3. What should be done to sustain progress? Well, we've talked about a lot of things today, and some draft recommendations have been assembled and now follow. Again, they're going to be featured in Monday's newsletter, so you'll get what we're going to read to you now on Monday, and will be the subject of the moderated panel discussion at next week's webinar, starting at 2 o'clock. Yes, 2 o'clock, not 4 o'clock next Friday. So Barry, did you get a copy of the latest draft of the resolution or recommendations? You're muted.
I think so, and I have them in front of me.
Well, once you read the vision, I'll tell you whether or not it's the last draft, because there was one word dropped out of that.
Alberta will facilitate and lead Canada in the development of a superior place that is a united and strong, tolerant and sustainable place to live and learn, work and play.
Keep on going.
Keep on going. I got to make a comment that we got to put a different lens in front of us, in between our ears, or as I say, my brains are in my feet. So in my feet. Next week, we got to talk Alberta, not Edmonton.
Right.
Edmonton as a component, maybe with the most potential to turn things around in Alberta, because we got further to go up. But to get into prescriptive stuff, I think would turn off the people we want to have listening. Anyway, I will read through this stuff and I'll stop after each element. And
but we're not ended discussion today. That'll come up next week. So I don't want to be overly prescriptive, but we've got a limited amount of time. If we start getting into discussions, we'll be here till midnight. So let's
Yeah.
just table the recommendations and let's hear what Justin
I'm-
and Lynn and whatever have to say next week.
I think the recommendation should be recommendations for further development.
Rather draft. That's why they're
rather than straight recommendations that are standalone.
right.
Okay, the first one I've got here is the survey reveals differences in the sentiment of Alberta's economic resilience overall by region and sector and since 2015. For Alberta's economic resilience to increase from the current overexposure to oil pricing requires diversifying into other industries while maintaining a balance of professions and public services. The requisite economic development warrants attracting others, growing locally, which I hate, but I'm not supposed to be editing, but I had to make that statement. And developing an effective innovation ecosystem. Those managing the ecosystem are responsible for addressing the ecosystem's weakest elements, management processes, and a sustained vision and leadership. Okay. Can I go on?
Yeah, proceed.
Energy transitions. The impact of climate change and geopolitical measures to respect the environment make Alberta, overall, its regions and all sectors particularly vulnerable to an economic dependence on the oil and gas industry. Development of hydrogen, progress in reducing oil sands emissions, electrification of transportation, net zero incentives, accessing new Asian markets are all complementary to an economy continuing to supply the global demand for energy while respecting the environment. But there must be more. Innovation and globalization. Distance to global markets and long-term supplier contracts have impeded diversification and the development of manufacturing Alberta's rich bounty of agricultural, forestry, and oil and gas materials. Today, globalization and emerging technologies are creating new markets, increasing productivity, and creating new employment opportunities. Alberta should capitalize on its competitive international advantage in many areas, particularly throughout Asia. The digital economy is largely independent of borders and distances and regulation. Competition is intense. Personalization is outstripping socialization, meaning clients are transforming into consumers as their economies mature. The digital economy, where data is the new oil, I repeat, data is the new oil, represents an extraordinary opportunity for Alberta industries, professions, and public services. Borders are irrelevant as data flows at the speed of light. The cost of storage has plummeted, and machine learning contributes to continuous learning. The implications are profound, as appreciated by any organization committed to applying artificial intelligence to their operations. No employment sector should be ignored and no community be left behind. Internet access is essential for any and all communities. Alberta must increase measures to develop and better manage its innovation ecosystem to attract and increase the growth of SMEs, and when appropriate, their participation in global value chains. Of particular importance is the pooling of private investment capital and mentorship. We heard that earlier. Innovation is the enabler. Significant growth opportunities have been highlighted, for example, and they are addressing significant concerns of Alberta youth about the future of work, given the rate of change, emerging technologies, and relevance of continuous learning. Creating a Western Canadian industrial hemp industry that would be of benefit throughout the agricultural supply chain and into education and research, manufacture and export, transportation, and I quit using the word transportation. It's all included in logistics, but transportation and logistics, so others may understand better than I do. Capitalizing on opportunities to strengthen Alberta's creative economy by further developing its film industry, currently strongest in the Calgary region. Next is committing to innovation in Alberta health by increasing competition and monitoring the personalization of former supplier-centric services. Next, fixing public procurement by engaging critical administrators and contractors in its review with the objective of improving its contribution to Alberta's economies. And the final bullet that is here now, participating in policy and industry development, anticipating the emergence of nuclear fusion energy and the associated social and economic implications. Systems during their development are supplier-centric, but once mature, transition to be more responsive to clients as customers, entrepreneurial suppliers, innovation and emerging technologies, and sustained public sector withdrawal. And then the new heading is public and personal service. Alberta has made extraordinary strides in the development of the publicly administered supply of health, education, and overall public services, the associated professions, and public services. But a transition of the entire public service system is underway. Yeah, that's a continuum that will go on forever. But anyway, the transition is being driven by increasing expectations of clients, competition among suppliers, and emerging technologies. As uncomfortable as it may appear, the Canadian culture commitment to public health, public education, public NGOs, public oversight is vulnerable to increasing expectation of a more educated and knowledgeable population, maturing of the knowledge economy, and technologies increasing competition for service. Growth of distrust between the public and public systems is an indicator of a more informed client consumer and the increasing relevance of market forces in governing the professions. The public service systems today are sustained by administrators committed to regulatory measures, maintaining the status quo, protection and privacy, but vulnerable to claims of overprotection, demanding for more choice and innovation and public sector austerity. Privatization is often cited as a policy option. It is not, but personalization is. The acceptance of market forces in transitioning public services from being supplier driven to being consumer responsive. That's essential. New heading. As for the professions, it is clear that their assessment of resilience follows that of the overall economy, more a recipient than a driver. The professions in general are self-regulated and empowered by government to manage explicit processes such as in health and education, law and engineering. They retain public trust by ensuring their members adhere to regulated practice standards and to otherwise discipline their members. Today, the professions are adapting to increased expectations of clients, increased competition, increased costs, competition from apps with the capacity to store, analyze, and learn. As if these challenges weren't enough, the professions are confronted by an increasingly litigious society, confounding their capacity to exercise their respective, or their regulated respective responsibilities. Regulated professions also have an obligation to keep up with the impact of the market, regulatory, and technological changes on contemporary practices, which includes fieldwork and educational requirements. When COVID forced learning online, most were not ready. Regulated professions must anticipate continuous change through 1, the conduct of policy research, 2, the development and timely implementation of practice standards, and 3, collaboration with government for aligning regulations, responsibilities, and market expectations. Now, the special cases of NGOs is the next heading. They are often overlooked as relevant to Alberta's economic resilience. There are over 23,000, as we heard earlier, NGOs in Alberta, one for every 150 Albertans. This subsector of public services is highly fragmented and has become overly reliant on public grants. They are, or should be, a contributor, a source of social enterprise and innovation, sufficiently independent of government to help make change and increase resilience as an organization and for its members. Members are needed to monitor and promote social enterprise and independence, accountability, and to incentivize their consolidation. So the survey, the objectives of the survey and reporting are to 1, draw attention to the status of the economy and the innovation ecosystem. 2, learn what measures affect a change in resilience and or effectiveness. And 3, affect an increase in resilience and effectiveness. We must all commit to continuous improvement and the engagement of others in the design, conduct, and distribution of the survey and reporting of results. This also means being open to the formation of alliances and partners to extend the reach, relevance, and influence of the survey to affect change.
Thank you, Barry.
The end.
It's 3 pages. Hopefully it touches on what we believe. I think we've discussed almost everything that's in there in the course of the webinars, we had before the survey and certainly during the survey that reinforced much of what we've been learning. So here we are. Next week should really be a highlight for all of us, because it's time to hear what others may have to say that are in some role of influencing economic development